Hello everyone. We're going to talk about imaginary numbers, which we represent with the letter I. So before we had anything to represent imaginary numbers, when we would get something like the square root of -4 as part of our solution, at that point we would just stop and say no real solutions. But we need some tools to be able to work with these types of numbers. And so what we know now is that we're going to use, change that to a pen, we're going to use I to represent the square root of -1. So anytime we see the square root of -1, we can replace it with I. The other thing we know is that if we square both sides of that equation, if we have I squared, that's going to equal -1. So this will allow us to simplify a lot of expressions, to come up with solutions when there are no real solutions, but we can represent them as imaginary solutions. And it will allow us to find additional answers. So in the introduction, they point out that after the invention of I, it becomes possible to find solutions for equations like x squared plus 1 equals 0. And let's just take a minute and just make sure we understand where they got that solution from. We have x squared plus 1 equals 0. We subtract 1 on each side, and we get x squared equals -1. When we square root both sides, this is where we then get x equals plus or minus I. And notice in this case, I did go ahead and include a plus or minus because -1 has both a positive and a negative root. And since I decided to square root both sides, we have to include both of those to be thorough. So this is how we can come up with the two roots or two solutions for that equation. So let's start with simplifying the square root of -4. Well, we can write -4 as the product of -1 and +4, and then this breaks us apart into two separate roots that we can simplify. We know the square root of -1 will give us an I, and the square root of 4 will give us a 2, so we would simplify this and write it as 2I. We know we want to leave it as a positive 2I because if we also wanted the negative root, there would have been a plus or minus sign out in front here. And since there wasn't one, we know we only want the positive root. The next one asks us to multiply 2I and 3I. And in fact, when we simplify this, we can multiply the exact same way we would multiply with any other variables like 2x or 3x, 2x times 3x. So we're going to get 6I squared, and then we'll want to go ahead and simplify I squared. We know I squared is equivalent to -1, so this becomes 6 times -1, or -6. When we go to simplify 2I squared times -5I, following order of operations, we need to go ahead and simplify this exponent first. Well, 2I squared is 2I times 2I, and that will give us a 4I squared. Well, we know that I squared is -1, so this becomes a -4 times -5I. So then we'll go ahead and multiply these together. -4 times -5 gives us 20, and then we have our I. And there's no further simplifying we can do on that one. Our final problem that we're simplifying is the square root of -25. And this is very similar to the first one that we did together. We're going to go ahead and split this up into the square root of -1. We'll write it as a product times 25. And then we can go ahead and simplify each part. The square root of -1 we know we can write as I, and the square root of 25 is 5. We do want to go ahead and rewrite it as 5I, similar to when we're working with other variables. We always put the coefficient first, and then the I will go second, even though the I isn't really a variable because it always stands for the square root of negative 1. And that is a simplified form of the square root of negative 25.